Welcome to Business Mastery with Dawn Kennedy, your quick under 45-minute dose of expert insights and strategies to make a positive impact on your business and life. Let's get started. Hello, and welcome to this episode of the Business Mastery Podcast. You are going to meet somebody who is so excited about a topic that we can all get behind, which is sales and use taxes. When we first had a conversation around this, I was like, that is such an important topic, but normally nobody specializes in that area. I'm so grateful that I found Holly to share everything that goes along with sales and use. So thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Amazing. All right. Can you tell everyone who you are and who you serve?
So I am known as the sales tax lady. No one usually knows my name. They call me, oh, you're the sales tax lady. So you can just remember me by that. But my real name's Holly Hoffman, and I'm the founder and owner of Sales Tax Advisory Network. I serve all businesses, any size. It can be small to very large companies. And it doesn't matter what industry you're in. Sales and use tax does affect everyone. So that's a misnomer. Some people will tell me I don't have taxable sales, which they sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But all our purchases can be affected by use tax, and businesses can be audited for their purchases. So it does affect everyone. And how I serve businesses is a little unique. I shouldn't say a little unique. I'm like a unicorn. So I provide employee and business development through sales tax training. And yeah, I get really excited about that. And can I just tell you something? So I'm a geek. I listen to your podcasts, and that's a good thing. Um, but you had on a guest a while back, and her name was Francie Jean,
Mhm.
and she's the founder of Terawatt. And she really gets the issue with my customers and my potential customers. So what her company does is deals with psychological um, safety in the workplace, right? And the whole blockage for potential customers bringing me in is their tremendous fear. And I guess what I always called it was no one wants to come in and have you look at their sales and use tax because it's akin to like going through their underwear drawer. They're like, I'm probably not doing it right. Or and Francie got into like managers don't want their employees knowing that they made a mistake. Owners don't want to find out what they're doing wrong because do I have to report it to the state? I mean, everyone just is so fearful. And especially when they hear that my background is in audit or that I worked for the government prior, it's like, whoa, like who's she going to tell? Or, what is she going to find? And once they get to know me or meet me or hear from other people that have worked with me, they're like, oh, it's a safe space. This is someone who's on our side. And it's not about being sides. It's just no one does it perfect. You're never going to get to complete perfection with sales and use tax because it's so complicated. And we're all in the same space. It's complex, it's difficult, but to avoid it and not talk about it
Right.
or not train and develop is crazy because it's so impactful to your business and it affects so many people in your company. So everyone who's brought me in has been like, this is amazing. And that's why I get so excited about it because it's a great feeling of satisfaction.
All right. That is fantastic. We're going to take the scary out of the sales and use tax. So let's start with 2 points. One is sales and use tax are typically state specific, right? So the sales and use taxes in Wyoming and the sales and use taxes in, I don't know, pick another state of Alabama, they're going to be at a state level. So
Right.
each state, so that's one of the reasons it gets complicated, right? But the second thing, just for all of us here, what do you mean when you say sales and use tax? Because people are like, well, we collect sales tax on what we're supposed to do, and we give it to the state, right? Some of us report monthly, some of us report quarterly, depends on what. Some of us have transient license because we do different counties. So we do our sales tax. What else is there?
So sales and use tax is the same thing. And most often I say sales tax and people are like, whoa, whoa, so you don't do use tax? So to shorten it, I just usually say sales tax. Um, so sales tax is what a seller charges on a sale of a taxable good. Use tax is what a purchaser may pay if the seller didn't properly charge them sales tax. So it's the same transaction. It's just whether a seller is charging it, that's the liability of the seller, or if the seller didn't properly charge, or maybe they weren't required to charge,
Right.
then the use tax on that same transaction is the purchaser's liability to remit use tax on a taxable purchase. So that's where, so individuals like you and I personally, when we're not in our business, when we're purchasing, states usually aren't going to go after a individual because that's just not really viable to audit individuals. The purchases aren't going to add up enough. But your business will get audited for use tax. And in fact, most audits aren't getting the sales tax isn't the big chunk of the audit. It's your purchases that you're missing. So whether it's not having proper documentation or that you didn't pay tax properly on purchases, that's where the big chunk of your audit's going to come from. Purchasing from out of state and you didn't remit use tax if you're in a taxable state.
Right.
So use tax is just the counterpart to sales tax. And every state that has a sales tax or a gross receipts tax has a use tax. So
Right.
that's the explanation of that.
Right. So between the purchaser side and the seller side, I think where you probably see this a lot is if somebody is buying something in wholesale. And when they buy it in wholesale, they submit a document that says, hey, this is a tax exempt purchase, for whatever. And that is so that the wholesaler isn't charging taxes. It's going to be the retailer's responsibility, right? When they go to the end consumer, maybe to collect a percentage, or that is probably where you see this the most. Is that pretty accurate?
Right. Yep. And resale is a common, that's not a problem. And some states you can, like Wisconsin, you can be a wholesaler and not hold a seller's permit. And seller's permit, just so folks know, a seller's permit doesn't allow you to sell things. It allows you to collect tax and registers you to be able to remit that tax to the state. So that's that. And if you have no taxable sales, you have no reason to hold a seller's permit. However, there's a couple states, for instance, Illinois, Florida, that you can't claim resale without holding a seller's permit. So there's little weird,
Right.
weird rules out there.
Right. I got
Gotta
you.
be careful with that.
Right. And those rules. So let's talk about some of the places like manufacturing, right? So you're bringing in raw goods and you have a finished product. What happens in there? Where do people get in trouble? So there's like number one, you're actually making the end thing to sell and you have raw material, right?
So manufacturing, the issue people have is that the they think as a manufacturer that because it's required to manufacture that it must be exempt. But manufacturing exemptions are very limited.
Okay.
So I get OSHA requires it or some other requirement or you it's required for the manufacturing process, but the sales and use tax exemption is very limited and they differ state to state. So if you are a manufacturer that has multiple plants, one in several states, just know that your manufacturing exemption or the electricity exemption, those differ state to state. So the scope of manufacturing or the consumables or anything like that, that's going to differ state to state. So don't assume that it's the same. And then also, some people manufacture and then do something else beyond that. They don't sell for wholesale. Sometimes they manufacture and then install their manufactured product. That can change what exemptions apply to their raw materials or what exemptions they qualify for manufacturing. So you got to be careful.
Okay, so let's take another business, like a service business. In some states, there's taxes on certain services and maybe not on some other services. So, if you want to start maybe a professional licensed firm like an accountant, or if you wanted to teach yoga classes where there's no physical product, what do we do there? How do we know? Where do we find that information?
So services are extremely difficult and you have to be careful because sometimes you can search and you don't see something listed and it depends on what you're looking under. So that one is tough and I recommend that you consult an expert on whether or not the whatever service you're providing is taxable or not. Because sometimes it can be services to tangible personal property and you're not searching for that. And you're like, oh, well, I didn't find my service. And that was under something that you're not expecting it to be. Or you didn't find your service and you assume, well, it must be taxable, but things that aren't taxable just aren't listed. So services to humans aren't listed in Wisconsin, but anything that's a service to a human is, if it's not listed, it's not taxable.
So just to clarify, services that might be taxable because tangible goods could be like HVAC repair.
Well,
Right. So it's a tangible good. So if they fix your AC, that might be taxable. But if they just if they're not touching tangible personal property, it may not be taxable. That's what you're saying. So there really is a case depending on the business to make sure, and especially if you're in like a border city and you maybe cross state lines, right? That changes state to state. This is why in the beginning you caveated it and said this is a safe space and nobody gets it perfect, right?
right. Yeah. And you really, and sometimes there's like multiple areas in the tax code that caveat very specific things. And though it says one thing here, and I even just submitted a request for, well, just it's a long story. Sometimes I set things up. And so sometimes I request Department of Revenue's input on something, even though I know the answer just to set it up for something else. And the initial answer I got back was incorrect. And they cited administrative code for something. And I'm like, okay, yes, that code is correct, but you're forgetting this other code. And then someone higher up was like, yes, they can't ever say that it's wrong. The answer was wrong. And I'm like, that was just a vague response. And we'll get back to you with a more more clarity on that answer. And I'm like, yeah, okay. But so you just have to be very careful because you can come up with a statute or a code that answers your question, but you might be missing another one that is more specific and overrides it.
Okay. So what about somebody who's retailing? They're taking goods from wholesale already manufactured. They don't actually make anything and they're just doing retail in a boutique or even online. There's additional or different taxes that could apply.
Yeah. So there you have to be careful about what jurisdiction you're in and what what product
Mm,
you're selling. So you have to look at, and this could be a service or product. So especially in urban areas, there's often a lot more additional taxes on top of it. So it could be expo or transient taxes or depending on what it is. So you have to be very careful. And can I just caveat here because I've run into this with a couple clients. You cannot Google tax rates,
mm.
and AI does not work for tax law for
Say that
sales.
again, louder in the back. Don't Google your tax rate. So generally, you said Department of Revenue. Is just about every state named the same thing, Department of Revenue? So if somebody in any state were to look, or are there a couple of other maybe popular names that you could see in different states? If somebody is listening in now and going, oh, I might need to have a look at that. Is it Department of Revenue
It's Department of
generally?
Revenue, Department of Treasury.
Okay.
Usually, if you look for the state and taxes, but just make sure it's the official state website.
Mm.
So sometimes if you Google, it will bring up um, an accountant site or some other tax service site.
Mhm.
Don't go to that. You want to go to the actual official government website. And every state has a tax rate lookup. So you can find that. So that's where you want to go if you want to find the tax rate for whatever you're selling.
Okay. So Department of Treasury or Department of Revenue,
Hmm.
you don't always need a seller's permit, so make sure that you do because it doesn't actually mean you're consumer facing. It could actually mean something else.
Right.
Depending on the business that you're in, there could be multiple places you would have to collect and pay those taxes or come out of pocket. Is that accurate?
Right. Yep.
All right, so now I'm gonna crack my knuckles here because if you're listening in, what are the states that make you the most when you have to look at them? Because I know there's gonna have to be a couple of states where it's like, if you're in this state, these are probably a little more complex than maybe if you're in a different state.
All of them? No. Um,
On there's 50.
it it really depends. So it really depends on what you're doing.
Mhm.
So my first thing is not what state it is what is the business and what are you doing? And are you physically engaged in business in that state or are you simply making sales into the state?
Mhm.
So um and then I go to what are you selling. So I guess I look at it not what is the state, it's what is my business doing. So I guess I don't get hung up on who is the state as much as what is my client doing so that I don't get overwhelmed with I guess I would go nuts if I was trying to know everything about every state. So the states that are the most difficult, I guess, and I haven't had to deal with New York as often. The few times I have had to deal with New York has been okay. But I hear New York is rarely consistent with tax treatment.
Mhm.
But knock on wood, haven't had any issues yet. Um, there's certain states that are very well, I feel like all the states are very pro audit right now.
Mhm.
So, um, Wayfair went into effect in 2018, then COVID happened, and the states kind of laid low for audit because they were gonna start auditing right after Wayfair went into effect, like a couple years after
Can
Wayfair
you
went into
can you
effect.
tell everybody what Wayfair is, that decision?
Yep. So Wayfair was a South Dakota decision, court decision that allowed interstate sellers to collect tax from the consumers if they made sales into other states over a certain um, dollar threshold or transaction threshold.
Right.
And that started October of 2018.
So online sales were no longer non-taxable, which was the
Correct.
general interwebs rule up to that point. You could order something, and even if it came from another state, you didn't have to collect the sales tax from the customer in the state. Where now, when you get on Amazon and you want to buy anything, it says sales tax to be collected, right?
So states wanted this because they were not getting the tax from the purchasers, the individual purchasers. They wanted to be able to collect from the seller and make the seller collect the tax from the purchasers. So they got it passed by eliminating small sellers because the small sellers wouldn't be able to implement this type of huge burden. So they had an exclusion for small sellers by the $100,000 threshold sales into other states. Since then, states are dropping the number of transactions. The threshold number of transaction is number of invoices. Um, so that doesn't hold up well in court because you could sell 200 keychains, which is a ridiculous low amount of tax, and that could cause you to have to collect tax in a state, and it could be pennies. So, so the number of transactions is being eliminated. Well, anyways, so now that Wayfair has been in for a while, COVID is over, and now states are going back and auditing these interstate sellers who only have sales in the states, and they share data among other states. And they're going back farther. So most states go back 3, 4 years for audit. If you aren't registered, they can go back. Technically, they can go back forever. Um,
Wow.
Wisconsin, if you're unregistered, they go back 6 years. But they're going back all the way to 2017, I'm seeing.
That's 9 years.
Yeah.
That's longer than the IRS, which goes back typically 7 for an audit, and you can file, I think it's 3 or 4 years back taxes without pay the penalties and stuff, but I mean, I don't think they consider that, um, punitive or whatever until you've missed, like, 3 or 4 tax years, right? I think you can do, like, the last 3 or something, but
But this
IRS
is
goes back 7, I think, for audits, right?
Yeah, but
And you
this is
guys
crazy because Wisconsin is all about being consistent and treating all taxpayers equally, and this
Mhm.
is not consistent
Mm-mm.
or equal.
Right. Yeah,
So
when I heard you start saying, when you're selling in another jurisdiction and is it just a sale or are you doing stuff there? I flashed back to the horrible, international decision from law school where it was like, do you have a nexus? Where's your headquarters? Where's your this? The all of the conflict of laws stuff. So Really, has every state now adopted, I guess, what you would call that Wayfair decision, or are there still some states that do not tax those internet transactions?
Pretty much every state has adopted, and it's different. It's varying thresholds. Um, Trying to think now, is Kansas still 0? Okay,
Were they the last holdout?
I can't remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, everyone has adopted. But my problem is that all my clients, everyone that I run across, has Wayfair stuck in their head, and they've completely forgotten physical presence.
Mhm.
So if you have a truck, if you have employees, and remember with COVID, everyone started working remotely,
Yeah.
and they've forgotten that having an employee in another state creates physical presence.
Right.
Um, so they've just forgotten this whole physical presence idea. And so people have physical presence, contractors, and they're like, "Oh, but I haven't met the threshold." And it's like, you don't have a threshold. You have physical presence. You're engaged in business in that state. So people need to remember that physical presence has existed prior to Wayfair.
For a while, yes.
Yes. And you're not going to have an excuse under audit for that. So yeah, so that is a big warning to people. Just keep in mind. And then some states have really crazy physical presence. Click through Nexus. If you have a button on someone's website that takes you right to your ordering to your website where people can make a sale, that gives you physical Nexus. Commission, paid commission to salespeople who aren't your employees in another state, that creates physical nexus. I mean, there's just a lot. So just be very wary of what you're doing in other states.
Right. Now, let me ask this broad question. If, let's say, you are doing business in 2 or 3 states, maybe you're a regional company, you would have to hold the permit in each of those states individually. So, not just I have mine where my primary plant is located, um, because it would again, this is where I think it starts to get complicated is not only is it maybe different in each state or what's required is in each state, you also have to keep up licensure in each state or a permit, I guess. Um, I know some of them are renewable, right? So after so many years, if you haven't transacted anything and they just look at you and they're like, well, they haven't done anything and they let it lapse. What are some of the other kind of tricky things that maybe we think we're being super compliant, but maybe we're not being super compliant?
Well, if you don't have any taxable sales, you don't need a permit.
Mhm.
But if you do have taxable sales and you have physical presence, then you better have a permit. And then also, if you have purchases, so if you have a physical presence and you are making purchases where you aren't remitting use tax. So if you aren't paying tax on all your purchases in that state, say you have a plant or something, maybe you aren't making sales there that are taxable. Okay, you don't need a seller's permit.
Ah,
Or maybe you're a contractor and you don't have taxable sales. I would not get a seller's permit. Okay. So get a seller's permit, but there's usually a thing called a consumer's use tax permit.
okay.
I would get that if you have taxable purchases on a regular basis. But if you don't have a reason to be registered, please don't get registered for a seller's permit and be filing zeros all the time because that creates tax liability unnecessarily for you. But if you do have taxable sales, you better be registered if you have physical presence, if that makes sense.
It does. So what this is even a regional company where you're in 2 or 3 states and you sell to consumers out of 2 of them, and in the 3rd state, you're just manufacturing, or that's where your delivery hub is, or whatever, that state, even if it's not consumer facing, maybe taxable sales, you still need to check and see if you need a use permit or a tax permit for the non-consumer facing uses that you might have to remit taxes for. Is that accurate?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
Correct.
This does get very complicated. Um, Obviously, you can work across all 50 states. So that was going to be my other question. Um, Typically, if it's a state specific thing, the states like to have somebody either registered to represent people in front of them or something like that, or like for the IRS, you have to have an enrolled agent sort of thing. Are you required, is your company required to be registered with all 50 states? Can you represent in all 50 states, and can you maybe do audit defense or something in all 50 states? Or is there a process or something that someone should be looking for if they're looking to hire someone to do this?
Okay. So I only do audit defense in Wisconsin. I don't do audit defense in the other states, but I will prepare you to avoid audit in the other states, and I can help on the back end.
Okay, perfect.
And I do have connections with other people, other accountants, and things like that. The big thing is to avoid audit and to make sure you're doing everything to make sure you're on the up and up and to educate your employees, which a lot of like Avalera and the big companies don't provide tax treatment answers, and that's what I do. So so yeah, I can do that. And sales tax isn't like income tax. The CPA doesn't register you for it doesn't test you on sales tax ability. So there is no registration for that. So
Okay. So the CPA doesn't talk about sales tax much, probably because they're like, it's just multiplication. Just multiply it by point zero,
it's a
six
local
five or something.
it's a local tax, and so your college education doesn't educate you on sales and use tax, and the CPA exam doesn't as well. So I would like someday to cover, like I would like it included in that, but right now it doesn't.
That is so interesting. That is so interesting, because I know whenever we have to submit stuff to our accountant, we have to submit proof that we paid sales taxes, right? Um, if we have taxable sales. So that's very interesting that this is not something that is more heavily pushed, because it affects every business, whether you're taxable or not. You have to have an awareness. And then for some people listening in today, this may be the first time that they are aware that there are other tax considerations beyond just, we don't have taxable sales, in general. So
But
this
it's like property tax. It's like it's there's a lot of taxes that we have covered. And I think it's interesting because now a lot of states are going away from income tax. And even if you have income tax in your state, sales tax is the primary revenue generator. So that's why I work at my job and I'm out here. I'm like, hey, you have to pay attention as a business. This is huge.
Right. Well, and now this makes a completely logical sense as to why they're cutting down, like auditing more, and really coming down on the sales and use tax, if they're using that to fill the coffers where they're reducing or eliminating like property tax, right? This just makes a whole big bunch of sense, because if they say, okay, we won't collect as much on this side, we still have to, have schools and roads and all the things. So if they've shifted that, I'm not going to say to the business community, other than the fact that the business community is responsible for accuracy, right? So the consumer's not responsible. The consumer is going to pay the tax that shows up on the register or online, or wherever it is, if it's charged. But it really is on the business itself to be compliant, to know about it, but then also to remit it. And this makes sense why they would be cracking down, because they're like, okay, we shifted it so that you could have lower property taxes, but now we want to know where it's all going.
Right. Yep.
So you said the trend is up for them doing audits and things like that. What have you seen since the pandemic? You said over the last couple of years. What are we looking at as a business community?
So, a lot of states are doing out of state audits, but everyone's doing out of state audits. And they're they're sharing that data with each other. So,
Oh.
um, and the other thing that they're doing, and this is totally legal. So this isn't it isn't like this is a scam. This is legal. When they audit a company out of state, they will cut that company a deal and say, okay, we're gonna just assess a percentage of your sales into our state. And then that allows them, they keep the customer list and then they audit all the businesses that were sold to, and they can pick up the use tax from those businesses.
Okay.
So they kind of, I consider it double dipping, but it's not technically because they didn't 100% assess the tax from the out of state self.
Right, and is it if it was owed and there was just an oversight or a lack of awareness or whatever, is it really double dimming, or they're getting what they were originally entitled to and the business owner didn't know they had to do it, right? So, I mean, there's an argument for that as well.
And
But
then the other big thing that states are focusing on is digital goods.
digital
So
so, like,
digital
downloaded courses and during the pandemic, you couldn't swing a dead cat without running into a free ebook or a paid ebook. That
Well, with
okay.
with everything moving um electronically, technology, services provided online, databases online,
Oh,
everyone wants information and resources. And with AI you can get numbers and data on everything, and everyone's selling data and information on everything, collecting data, providing data, and that's data and information, right? And it's huge. The numbers are astronomical. The billions, hundreds of billions, that this industry has grown, and states are finding ways to tax that.
okay.
And you'll see that there's a lot of changes in digital goods and how they're trying to pick that up and tax it, and whether or not it's constitutional interstate, and actual federal court cases going through with that, and state cases. So that's the huge thing, and the reason is because it's such huge dollars.
Right, yeah, they want their cut, and so, we can complain about it, or we could just be those aware business owners that are like, "Okay, this is part of what we have to do," and, some people will collect the tax from the consumer at the time of sale, some people roll the tax into the price, and then they submit their portion. So, I mean, there's a million different ways to do it legally, ethically, morally correctly. But yeah, after this conversation, it's like, boy, this is a lot more complicated than probably the average business owner knows. I know it's eye-opening for me. Um, and we okay, how can they find you? How can they reach out? Let's just put that out there as well. So they can't go into white pages and go the sales tax lady, although that would be really cool. So where can they find you and have a conversation with you? And
But you can almost go to the white pages. You can go online, salestaxlady.com.
fantastic.
So, and that's how you get connected with me. Holly at salestaxlady.com is my email, and my website is salestaxlady.com. So I truly I am the sales tax lady. So why not just embrace it, right?
I love that. It is so clear. Uh I think sales tax lady though really did not until this conversation, make me think about all of the other nuances that go with it. So this has been very eye-opening conversation. If you're driving and listening and you have any questions, or you're regional, you're in multiple states, or you didn't know, then I would encourage you to reach out and don't use AI, right? So don't
Right.
Google, don't use AI. Make sure you're using the proper state information. And just to recap, it was Department of Revenue or Department of Treasury for most states,
Yes.
and you reach out to the sales tax lady, Holly, to get that clarity, make sure you're in compliance, because the last thing I think anybody wants is to find out they thought they were always doing the right thing, and I'll bet that's the majority of her clients. They just didn't know.
And everyone is trying to do the right thing. Like everyone, even when I was in audit, well, there was a few people who were fraudsters, but everyone is trying to do the right thing and we're all in the same spot. And when you work with me, you understand that it's not always clear and it's okay. And no one expects anyone to be, rocket scientists at sales and use tax. So it's totally okay. You find out that you're in a community of everyone understands.
I love that. Yeah. So again, psychological safety is present if you want to reach out to Holly and get her eyes on whatever you may need support with. So thank you so much for joining me. We've never covered this. I didn't realize how important it was until we did the pre-call, and it was like, wow, there's just so much more. You are the very first specialist I have ever run into in this tax area. So thank you for, coming on and generously sharing everything with us.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. We'll talk to you all next time on the next episode of the Business Mastery Podcast. Take care. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Business Mastery Podcast. If you want to learn more about me, you can go to dawnkennedy.com, and you can now check us out on YouTube, as well as, of course, any of your favorite platforms that host podcasts. Take care.